Okay, aloha kako, good evening. How are we all doing tonight? Very excited. Well done. Also, happy International Women's Day. If you don't know, some great events going on around the world.
Right.
Please do check them out. I mean, it's late now, so I suppose many of them have stopped. But nonetheless, go check them out. It's joy about being Hawaii. We're always sort of last, you know. It's like New Year's Eve. You know, everyone's already done in bed. And we're like, yay, New Year's. Good times. Anyway, this is a fun microphone that keeps moving. So hello everybody, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Borders&Brooks. I'm a lecturer in the English faculty in medieval British literature. I'm also the founder and director of Converging Epistemologies, which you are all now at, if you're unaware. There were signs, just saying. In lieu of the longer introduction to who we are and what we do, which I went over on our first event, we have a video online. You can check that out at your leisure. So in short, though, very simply, we seek here to recognize the world is complex, layered, interdependent, and that we are here to address the issues of our contemporary world. We must bring together our different ways of knowing, our epistemologies. We seek to join with ways of knowing outside the academy, for just as we bring a variety of skills and approaches, so too do all of you. Only when brought together in productive dialogue and action can we find answers to the difficulties that we all face. So our theme tonight, again, if you didn't see the flyer, is borders and boundaries between countries, peoples, languages, genders, elements, animals, identities. As humans, we are delineators, distinguishing this from that, categorizing for the sake of knowing. This is sea, that is land. Yet lines such as these are, in many ways, artificial, and often more porous, blurred than we let on. We ourselves are an example of this. I am white, male, father, overeducated scholar of British literature. Yet I was raised here, nurtured by the Ko'olau streams, taught by the sea, instructed by Mahanai Tutu from Miloli. I spoke pidgin with friends, prescriptive English with teachers. Each piece delineated, each piece a part of the whole. The lines are blurred, porous. More broadly, as humans, we carve up islands and continents with black ink and declare this patch mine, that patch yours. Yet walk to the edge, straddle the divide, and you will find the dirt on both sides is the same. The flowers are the same. The roots of trees transgress our lines back and forth. The earth shrugs off our easy distinctions. We encode information in phoneme, syntax, tone, gesticulation, breathing out meaning as our ears drink it in. Yet my words are not your words. Does this divide us? Unite us? What would happen if I learned yours and you learned mine? Yet language is more than just a mechanism for conveying information. It is culture. It is identity. Its structure and form echo the lives of our ancestors, their decisions, failures, successes, and journeys. Monolingual, bilingual, second language speaker. Unite or divide? We create binaries. Dark and lights, male and female, child and adult, heterosexual and homosexual, animal and human. Yet where are the lines? What distinguishes animal from human? Do we not eat, breed, seek shelter, safety, so that our genes may continue? Where is the line between male and female? Are the lines helpful, damaging, or necessary? And so tonight, our esteemed panel will do just that, interrogate borders and boundaries, for our current moment is filled with division. We often stand apart, our lines firmly inscribed around us, and peer out, judging, fearing, clinging to the familiar. Together in this space, let us seek something a little bit. And so I'd like each of our panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about who they are and what they do.
Hi, I'm Jade Higa, and I'm with the English department. I'm a lecturer there. I specialize in bisexuality in women in 18th century British literature.
Hi, I'm Nandita Sharma. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology here at UH Manoa, and I research international migration as well as ideologies of racism and nationalism.
So, aloha mai kako. I'm Kamana Mai Kalani Beamer. I'm an associate professor split between School of Law and School of High Knowledge. Most of my work is kind of at the intersections of governance, resource management, and land tenure in Hawaii.
I'm Reese Jones. I'm a professor in the geography department. I'm a political geographer that studies borders, migration. I've done work in the past about border walls and deaths in the migration process.
Excellent, thank you very much. So the way this will work is we'll start with a question and the panelists will get to respond as they will. We'll have a jovial discussion, hopefully get some interesting thoughts going. So we're going to start, as of course academics always do, with definitions. So the first question for the panel is, how might or should we define the terms we're using tonight, borders and boundaries? Who would like to go first?
Perfect. Pulling up my dorky notes. So I thought specifically about the way that borders and boundaries can be kind of figurative and how they can kind of, as I see them, insidiously influence our lives in the way that we see each other. So specifically, I thought about gender, and it's something that I speak with my students often about. You know, something that Britton mentioned in his introduction, the perceived border between masculine and feminine, and the way that there's often this kind of very firm line that separates the two, and they're kind of placed as opposites of one another. But in reality, the gender spectrum is so complex, and there's so much between above and below masculine and feminine, and most of us would not fit perfectly into what is stereotypically masculine, what is stereotypically feminine, and yet we kind of expect ourselves to meet this ideal of what is femininity, what is masculinity. So it seems to me that the figurative border is not just between male and female, masculine and feminine, but also kind of the border that we place around ourselves, and the border that we kind of perceive of ourselves. Specific definition of borders and boundaries.
I also appreciated Britton's comments at the beginning, because I think the way that you were talking about it goes along really well with the way that I conceive of these concepts. That I think of borders and boundaries as an imaginary thing. It's something that we as humans try to impose on the world around us to bring order to that space, to bring into being some sort of ways of making that space legible, making it a way that we can conceive of the edges of what is inside and outside of a particular space. But these things are always human ideas. It's something that we create and then we impose upon the world around us to make sense of it, to bring it, to create the knowledge, and define those categories of the inside and the outside of it. You know, I do work on borders, and so a lot of times people are like, oh, but you live in Hawaii, you've got a fixed border around the island, right? But even that it's an imaginary thing, right? I mean, if you think about the ebb and the flow of the ocean, and the you know, when we have these king tides, the water is much higher than it is, right? And then at low tide, it's way back out in a very different place, right? It's not a fixed line, it's not a boundary exactly. Instead, it's this zone that's moving in and out, that nevertheless we conceive of as this sharp edge, as an outside of a place. And then when we draw that on a map, we absolutely draw that as a line, right, as a fixed location. And so with my work on borders and walls, a lot of the work that I do is to think about how people, after they've imagined this boundary and they've drawn it onto a map, how they then enact that on the ground and bring it into being. Because as I'm sure many of you are aware, most of the borders that exist in the world today are less than 300 years old. Most of them are like 60 or 70 years old. And even that's when they were drawn on a map. And many of them on the ground aren't necessarily there all the time or at particular moments. Instead, they're porous and they're imagined. And so when you build a wall, that's this enactment of this edge, right? It's bringing into being this imagined container of space that we see on the map and we imagine to be there, but doesn't necessarily exist on the ground until humans go there, build a wall, put a border guard, shoot people who try to cross a border, arrest them, detain them, send them back. That those actions of human bring into being this imaginary space of the state.
Awesome. Sure.
Give it a go, come on.
O nauna I tahala me ta lehua. E hali lehua no yana tano e. Ta uno ia ia no inei. E lia nei ho i o tahiti ma. Ahiti mai no outou, ahiti puno me te aloha. Aloha e, aloha e, aloha e. Aloha mai kākou. So I guess when I think of palena or boundary is a hard word. I'm not sure it translates super well into Hawaiian conceptions of what delineates a place and people's relationship to places and resources and human and non-human elements. But the chant I just shared is talks about smells. The smell of the hala when it's blooming, right? Talks about approaching a place with caution, reverence, and aloha, announcing yourself where you come, and greeting what's there, seen and unseen. And so I agree with all of that boundaries in many cases can be constructs, human constructs to categorize and organize space, place, and resources. And sometimes they can be, fluid, but they may not only be based on, our sight and our vision. They might be based on our smell, our feelings that we have associated with a place and the stories that we recall of those places. They might be categorized by the resources that are, of that particular place. And so I guess probably most of what I'll be talking about is maybe some of these, things that I've come to know and study around palena, the way that our ancestors set up place boundaries, to demarcate access to resources. And these weren't walls where you couldn't cross or you'd get shot if you moved across, but they were ways that provided, what some people see as the most remote islands on our beautiful planet, the opportunity to have a population create abundance and thrive at levels that were pretty remarkable at that time period. Certainly Europeans' interactions with Hawaii and the Pacific, we know, helped them to formulate probably misguided concepts of sovereignty, right? They saw islands, they saw them bounded by, oceans, that for them oceans were, full of demons and sea monsters, right? For Pacific peoples, they were a mother. They were a gateway, they were a pathway for other islands and other places. So I'm not sure that we see it, entirely the same, but I think islands and the Pacific have fundamentally impacted our perceptions of boundaries and sovereignty and place.
Yeah, so I think if the way that we started this conversation was imagining borders as organizational structures, and I agree with that, but I would argue that they organize particular kinds of social relationships and social structures. So I don't think that, there's often a tendency to engage in what historians would call presentism, right? So that we take the structures and ways of thinking and being that we have today and read them well into the past. So, for example, I've been reading the Bible recently because I'm really interested in this Tower of Babel story. And when you read most translations of the Bible now I'm reading them in English. They refer to the existence of nations. Back in the time of post-flood, and the survivors of the flood are building this Tower of Babel, and God gets pissed off at them and ruins it, right? and of course, there was no nations back then, right? So I think that, there's a kind of presentism with borders as well. The imaginary that borders as we have them today have always existed, even political borders, even borders of, well-organized, hierarchically organized states, that somehow they had the same kinds of borders we have now. And we know that that's not true. Imperial states had a very, very different conceptualization of borders and belonging than do nation states, for instance, right? Nation states in particular have very hard borders, and people who imagine themselves as nations tend to have very hard borders as well, right? You're in the nation or you're out of the nation, whereas imperial states, empires, right? They want everything. They want everything that everyone owns. So they don't have a end point. They don't have a finish line. The world ideally is what empires want. And nation states are very different because nation states they want the wealth of our planet and the wealth of our labor, but they don't want to incorporate everyone politically into that state, right? So when the United States invades and occupies Iraq or Afghanistan, most recently, obviously the United States has a long history of invading and occupying people, as we know, sitting here in Hawaii. They don't make Iraqis or Afghanis American citizens, right? They remain Iraqi and Afghani citizens, and they still get exploited, et cetera. So there's very different kinds of borders depending on when we're talking about. And nation states in particular invent a category and a kind of relationship between people that makes sense to us today but wouldn't have made sense even in the 19th century, right? Which is this category of migrant, right? The person who does not have a fundamental right to move into the territory of another state or a quote-unquote nation, right? So, imperial states didn't have immigration controls, right? They were trying to keep everyone in, so they had a lot of exit controls, but they didn't necessarily have entrance controls that we now totally take for granted. And I think that boundaries is when we start getting into very nebulous territory, right? Because that's such a kind of psychological concept right now, boundaries. Like, your psychologist might tell you need stronger boundaries, right? And stuff like that to protect yourself and to remain an integral being, right? So even in that kind of psychological translation of borders into boundaries, we start getting into these very hard insides and outsides, and this very defensive posture of if you let people in, you're in trouble, right? So I think that from my perspective, borders exist when human societies are organized into class relationships, right? There's no evidence. So again, going back to this presentism, there's no evidence that human societies prior to the existence of some kind of state structure, whether it was like a full-blown imperial state or it was a quasi-state, like a few people were trying to act like states in any particular human community, like, I'm the ruler, you're the ruled over. Could be quite minor, but still, human societies without states didn't have constructs of insides and outsides. They had much, much more fluid ideas of belonging, much more fluid ideas of place. And getting to this place, and I'll stop there, when we have an imaginary of borders and boundaries, we have a very different imagination of land, right? We often talk about land. When we talk about land, what we're usually talking about is territory, right? We're usually talking about some group has delineated, usually through class and state relationships, a particular land on our planet as their territory of one sort, imperial territory, national territory, etc. But land is a very different thing than territory, right? Because all human beings and all life forms on our planet are on land, right? So we all have a relationship to land, but how we are seen to have a relationship on land then gets overlaid with all these ideas of, like, do you have formal belonging to this land? Do you have national citizenship? Do you have, are you of the quote unquote right race? right? So on and so forth. So I think that, the current conceptualization of borders and boundaries is not the way that most human societies, states are what, like 6,000 to 7,000 years old, and that's it, right? Which must tell us that classes also came into being at that time, because once human societies organize themselves as classes, they create states to protect those classes, right? So that's really tiny in the whole history of the world, right? So when we're talking about borders and boundaries, I think we need to keep that historical definition in mind.
Thank you. I think I'm going to combine several of the questions and try and go off of what you've all been saying. So I think going back to what you said about this a sort of wider historical perspective and taking something that you said, Reese, one thing I want to throw in here is the unfortunate implicit distinction, of course, we're making between ourselves and animals, right? We're considering ourselves to be distinct already, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one thing I like to mention, of course, is animals have territories. They defend them very vociferously, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure, there are certain animals that you wander in a territory, they will destroy the other animal for showing up in there. So there is something not simply human about the idea of delineating land that is a land or ocean, right? I mean, we have creatures who live in the ocean as well, who have ranges they go to in different ways. So I just wonder, on one hand, if there is kind of a deeper thing of just being an animal, in a sense, that pushes us towards an inherent desire to have this as our bit, that is to some degree safer. So that was one thing. And connected to that is to go with the second question, which was the purpose of these things. I think you started touching on that. I'd like the rest of you to kind of jump in on this. The purpose of borders, and boundaries, whether historically defined, whether based on some kind of almost animistic instinct. I think we've all touched on different kinds and different ways of perceiving them and constructing them. But I think I would probably argue that the majority of them have some kind of purpose, as you said, right? Nation states create these borders for specific reasons. And then I love what you were saying, Kamana, about the very distinct difference between the view of the ocean in a Western and a kind of Hawaiian sense, right? Where in one, it is a limiting force. It is the edge of the world. It is the place which stops us, versus it is essentially what connects us. It's what allows us to be who we are. It is, the connective tissue of ourselves. And so I guess my question for all of you is bringing it all together to questions of purpose and connecting again to the fact that it seems like there is something animistic at its goal about having some kind of territorial relationship to space.
Well, it seems like I think that question is really interesting, Britton, about that animalistic nature, because it seems like the desire to defend your territory really comes from desire to protect that territory. So in my head, I kind of jumped to one instinctual feeling, I think, for all animals, which is fear, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems like borders are fear-based. And I was thinking about, I have a couple dogs, and they have different foods because they are, special in their own way. And one of them is, he's the male dog, and he's slightly more aggressive. And so he's always trying to get the female dog's food, and she gets very upset by this. And so really, there's no reason for them to be upset, because I will always give her enough food. But the instinct for her is fear and protection, that she won't have enough. She doesn't want what she has been given to go to somebody else, to this other dog. And I think the human side comes in when we take that fear and we turn it into pride, to say that I'm afraid of losing my nation, and so I'm going to have ultimate pride in my nation to show that this nation cannot be defeated. And that pride is not something that necessarily comes in with my dog Molly, but I certainly feel it when I talk about Kaneohe. So I think that's kind of where that psychological human bit comes in.
It's me? We're going in the same order? Okay. Sure, I can jump in. I guess for me, I kind of want to fall back to definitions maybe a little bit, because to me, in the question you were asking, you were blurring some boundaries between some categories for me between the idea of place as kind of a place of belonging and meaning attached to a particular location, and territory, which to me is a very different thing, right? Territory is this bounded space of jurisdiction where someone claims exclusive control over the resources, the people, and the land inside of that area. I think of those as being quite distinct. And your question about are we being, preferring humans in the way that we think about these things, one way I would point out that's different is humans making maps. And a lot of the things that Nandita was talking about, the changes with the way that people think of ideas of land and turning that into property and turning it into a territory or a state, I would suggest, and a lot of geographers have made this point for me, that those are very much tied to the invention of modern maps, right? Of the ability to view the world from a God's eye perspective and to produce these representations of space from a perspective that none of us actually have, right? And it allows us to kind of visualize the world in these bounded areas in a way that other animals cannot. And also, I would suggest, in a way that most humans prior to the 1600s did not. Because it simply wasn't possible to conceive of the world in these bounded containers that we have today. So I would say it's not by chance at all that the enclosure movement in England happens in the starts in the 1500s, because that's the era from there's this quote of this cartographer talking about the history of cartography, and he says in 1500 maps in England were unknown objects. By 1600 they were familiar to the elites across the entire country, and so it's at that moment that suddenly it's possible to draw these boundaries on a map and claim these properties as your own rather than the common spaces that they had been before. And it's also that moment that the borders of countries start to come into being, right? The first borders are drawn in Europe in the 1600s, right? There's the 30 Years' Wars, this devastating, inconclusive war. But in the aftermath of that, there starts to be these treaties between countries, like the Treaty of the Pyrenees, for example, where they decide to sit down and draw a line on a map of where one people's territory is and the other one's is. So it's a completely different way of conceiving our place in the world that's mediated through this new technology of the map.
Yeah. So I get a sense that I agree completely. Sort of nation-state capitalistic boundaries that divide and exclude what's inside and what's outside are constructs and don't bring out the best in people. Empower elites. Absolutely at the expense of others, and are there in many cases to solidify, maintain power. And I guess what's interesting in Hawaii, so imagine these islands, when our first, Pacific ancestors are arriving here with varieties of taro, bananas, some pigs and some chickens, right? And we know for certain that there's multiple waves of migrations once our islands are found. And what chance and history Mo'olelo tell us about these islands is that over time, as our islands became immensely populated, groups of people started to have conflicts over resources, and there was warring amongst different families, different parts of the island, and what ended up happening was here on this island, Oahu, there's a chief by the name of Maili Kukahi, and he went around the island and spoke with families and people that were all across diverse locations, and he started to solidify the Palena, what were really these boundaries for what we know of as the Ahupua'a system today. And these are very unique types of boundaries. Like I said, they didn't define who could come in and who couldn't, but they demarcated who has access for certain types of resources. And when they divided our islands, they did so in a Mauka to Makai fashion on the whole. Not all Ahupua'a run Mauka to Makai. And then they created boundaries that extend into the ocean, right? But these Palena, all of the accounts, and Maili Kukai is probably the first one, and on Kauai there's a chief that's around his contemporary. His name's Mano Kalanipo. These two islands first create these divisions, and then it extends to Maui with Kaka'analeo. He also does Molokai, and on Hawaii Island it's a little bit later with a chief named Umi. So what all of the stories say is that these boundaries enabled greater abundance, and they simplified warring groups, access to certain resources. So they created some level of compromise, and they defined people's relationships. And so I think there is that role. Somehow boundaries define relationships, right? I mean, even with animals, I've seen dogs, tear up cats, and then I've seen dogs make friends with cats. Right, and it's because of a relationship that they develop over time. So not all cats are enemies of dogs, and so I think there is a role for understanding our relationships with each other and our resources, and the limits of those. And I guess that's sort of what these Palena did. And at its height, there were 1,625 ahupua'a throughout all of Hawaii, on all of our islands. And I guess, today, with Matson containers that ship in everything that we need, and our understanding of these incredible military technologies that allow groups of powerful people to kill, hundreds of thousands with the press of a button, or, our entire islands to hide behind tables at Starbucks because of a fake missile alert that we all experienced. I mean, that's what we live in today. But if we were living in a time where we were completely dependent on the resources of this place and each other to survive, we might have different types of boundaries.
Thank you. Want to jump in, Mandy?
Yeah, I don't know about the animal thing because I don't know enough about animals.
This is my attempt to be a pseudoscientist. We can ask Justin as the actual scientist later.
Yeah, it would be interesting to talk to, behavioral scientists who study animals because, of course, there's a long history of human beings talking about animals as a way to legitimize or normalize particular sets of social relationships that they want to do. I mean, we all know about the homosexual penguins, right? And the Republican Party that freaked out about them, right? Wanted to ban, I don't know if they wanted to ban penguins. I don't know what the hell they wanted to do with penguins. But, like right now the migrant justice movement has adopted the butterfly, right, as its animal of choice, to emphasize actually that migration is absolutely central to a sense of place, that migration is crucial for survival, that migration is quote unquote natural. Right, because every time we go to the animals, what we're trying to do is naturalize human social relationships and human political practices, right? Like, if the animals do it and we do it, then it must be natural. So I think we should always be wary of that, because someone's dog and another person's butterfly is just, whatever. We're engaging in representational strategies to try and make a political point, right? Rather than actually dealing with animals, right? So it's classic displacement. But I think when we're I don't know very much about the ahupua'a system, and so please correct me if I'm wrong, but many human societies have faced population pressures, and migration is a classic response to population pressures, right? And my understanding is, particularly in the Pacific, that population pressures often led to people voyaging and looking for new places where they could thrive. So I think that, I don't think that population pressures naturally lead to the erection of boundaries such as the Ahupua'a, right? Because the Ahupua'a, were they not also taxation systems? Were they also not systems by which, people who were in any particular Ahupua'a were paying some kind of what we today would call taxes, right? So I think that, when we start talking about that, then we're already talking about a particular kind of social, particular kind of society and particular social relationships that have been established that are already moving us away from the commons, right? So I understand from reading some archaeological studies of old Hawaii, where we can kind of measure the shift from when there were the social relationships of the commons in Hawaii and the shift to the social relationships of the Ahupua'a, right? And I don't think that those shifts were necessarily only driven by population pressures. I think they were also driven by the same kinds of things that drive those shifts across the world, right? Like Reese talked about the enclosures in the English countryside in the 16th century. Similar kinds of processes, right? Different efforts for people to control land and territorialize it, right? So I think we need to kind of pay attention to the fact that there actually may be greater abundance when things are held in common than when we construct boundaries and rules about use that limit access to resources. But so I think again, like the penguins and the butterflies and the wolves, there's examples that kind of buttress our own political viewpoints sometimes, right? So each situation has to be looked at very, very carefully to not become a general statement, right?
No, so you want to jump in?
Sure.
Yeah.
If I could
No, please.
respond,
Yeah.
because there were several things said about Hawaii that I don't think are correct or
Okay.
accurate. And that's what's really interesting is we talk about not generalizing, but at the same time we want to apply things like commons to Hawaii. And it turns out there was no word for commons, makalal Hawaii, because it's really a European, English construct. But what I'm talking about with the Ahupua'a system is it defined, who had access to certain resources, and certain things are certainly shared. So it wasn't about demarcating, all of this resource, all of the ivory tooths are mine, solely. But it was a balance of bottom up and top down management, I think, of resources when it thrived, when it worked at its best. And at least all of the historical accounts that every Hawaiian historian that's ever talked about Palena said what it did was, what I had talked about, that it was in response to the buildup of populations on these very small remote islands. So it's not that this concept needs to be applied to North America or any other continents for that instance, but it is something that's fairly unique. With Hawaiians, even with our Pacific cousins, the Maori, for instance, who, at least some of the archaeological evidence and our own stories say that there are groups of Hawaiians that went to Aotearoa, not actually as a result of increased, buildup in population or response to population, but actually we were voyagers. We wanted to discover our planet and understand what else was out there in the world. It wasn't just that we were hapless, victims of sex and giving birth. We actually wanted to know what was out in our universe, and we explored that. But when we went to Aotearoa, it was a completely different system that was developed. The boundaries there became very fluid. The society morphed into, a little bit more of society that wasn't as stratified as it became here in Hawaii. And I think some of that obviously is human constructs and influence. And parts of it were about extracting resources, but taxation is, I'm not sure that that really translates to what was here. But for instance, when Europeans were here and we go through this process of the mahele, one of the biggest struggles was that our people here understood the resources of the oceans and created very distinct notions of places within the ocean with boundaries and access to resources that couldn't be mapped, because we had the technology of the time was chains, right? That you couldn't go out and lay chains in the middle of the ocean. So we understood the ocean on a level that the technology at the time made it impossible to map. So they had to struggle with that and name, well, on the coastline, it's roughly here. And later on, when we were able to get better cartographic tools, they started to map out some of these boundaries in the ocean. But I don't know. I don't know. It's not that it's the ideal state by any sense, but just to try to reflect what happened here and how do we make sense of it. Because surviving on these islands for as long as our ancestors did, with the resources, limited resources that we had, is pretty remarkable, and certain things that we had to do.
Thank you. I think I'm going to kind of drive this on to the next question. I think it works really well, which is about the potential usefulness of borders and boundaries. So I just want to jump in a couple of things. First off, I totally agree. The animals thing was sort of a way to try and focus in a specific direction. But of course, I mean, this is a famous example David Attenborough often gives when people use the beauty of the natural world for various things. He's like, it's beautiful, but it's also terrible. He goes to things like, the zombie ants, right? There's this fungus that takes over the brain of an ant, makes it climb up a tree and die, and then it like shoots out of its head and shoots spores everywhere. So, I'm pretty sure the ants, I'm not sure what it's a metaphor for, but I guarantee the ant is not happy about this, right? So I'm not sure what kind of political ideology you could gain from using that as an example, but I agree, right? We do pick the things that work for us. I completely agree. But I think what I want to get at with the question of the potential usefulness of boundaries, going off of the way that Ahupua'a function, because I could correct around, there was something more than 1 million people, right, in pre-contact.
I think at a low estimate there was almost 700, maybe 600,000 at a low, and at a high, recent PhD study modeled the resource capacity of our traditional agricultural and ocean systems, and could have fed about 1.2 million people.
Right, which is almost essentially our current population anyway. So I think my question about the potential benefits are, my example, modern sort of, to bring this into our modern moment, is fishery management, forestry management, right? So for example, there's a great bit of Norway. There's this one specific fjord where the herring population was decimated by overfishing, absolutely decimated, down to almost nothing. And the Norwegians went crazy. Like, this is a terrible thing, we need to do something about it. And they did such intense management. It is now one of the greatest explosions of herring on the planet. And they have, hundreds of humpback whales and killer whales and all these things now have come back. And so it's an example of a moment in which the creating a border or a boundary, depending on how we're going to define either of these, for access to resources and managing it well, has benefited both the fishermen who used to fight each other and the whales to get stuff, and the general ecosystem. So I suppose my question for the panel is, are they useful sometimes? And if they are, how, when, etc.? We don't have to go in the same order. You really can.
I was going to say, I'm not going to go
You can
first.
totally jump in whenever you like. Who'd like to jump into this deep end?
So I'll throw some things out there. I mean, I guess I have talked about some of the usefulness, at least in my conception, with the management of resources. And managing resources is kind of a weird phrase, pretty paradoxical. It's not that we manage them. We sort of create boundaries for humans to interact with resources, to provide their existence, over a longer period of time when it's done well. And I think that was some of the benefits of, some of these ahupua'a boundaries. I think we had other boundaries in earlier Hawaiian society that, don't make a lot of sense today. We had these pulo'u sticks where, you basically, it was a chiefly residence, and if you weren't of a certain rank and you crossed it, there was one punishment, and it didn't turn out very well for you. So we definitely had boundaries that, from a standpoint today, it was kind of, I'm not sure we'd want to recreate those. But Palena that provided, again, this balance of, if you're living in these islands, okay, and you're trying to live as a functioning society, you need people on the ground that understand the intimacy of each of their places, right? The lobster holes in Waianae are different, right, on these older geologic islands than they are on Hawaii Island, where you have very little similarities in reefs. So you need people that intimately know the resources of their place. You need to know how these creatures spawn, in what periods of time, because it's actually different from island to island. Creating these palena, these somewhat fluid boundaries that at least told people these are, you have every access, Maukuta Makai, to these resources, gave them that sense of intimacy of place over time, right? That allowed it to thrive, where you wouldn't want to go and fill 10 coolers full of lobster because you know that, your uncle and your auntie are going to suffer, right? And so I think there is some function, right, around resources and fluidity of boundaries that can better manage and access those.
Excellent, thank you.
I can agree. I can see the way that it's useful to bound a space in order to protect a resource there. But I would argue, and I do argue in my book, Violent Borders, that the act of bordering is an inherently violent act. If you draw a line and you say that some group of people are limited, that they have access to this, and other people don't, that's an act of violence, right? Because either you enforce that and you use violence against them to stop them from coming into this place. Today we might use a fine, for example, if someone fishes in a place that they don't do, or we arrest them or something like that. That's an act of violence towards them. It's limiting their movement. It's not allowing them the freedom to move to different places and access the resources there. So drawing a boundary, to me, drawing a border is inherently violent. It's a violent act. Could it be used in some instances for a good purpose? Maybe. But it is an act of violence to draw a boundary, I think. And if you look at the history of these terms, like the term territory, we often think of it as derived from the word terra, from land, but the origin is from terrorize, right, to scare people off, right, is the origin of the term territory, right? So the terror side of it is where that word comes from, right? So the inherent act of creating a territory, of creating a bounded space, is also about the act of scaring people off of that space, of using violence, of threatening them to keep them away from this place that you claimed. So to me, borders are inherently violent.
Yeah, so if you don't mind.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Borders and boundaries are incredibly useful, right, in our world today. They make our world today. The world that we have today is a world in which where you ended up on that roulette of citizenship as you were being formed into a child that was going to be birthed by your mother, right? Where, the citizenship lottery is today the greatest, one's nationality, what citizenship you have. And most of us have the citizenship that we're born with, right? So the citizenship lottery is today's greatest indicator of your life chances and your life outcomes. So, borders and boundaries in our world of nation states today maintain a global system of incredible inequalities and incredible disparities. And just, one statistic that, I find really incredible to show the work that Borders do is a statistic that was developed to show that The bottom 10th decile in terms of well-being in the United States, the bottom 10th. And if you're in that bottom 10th, that is a very, very hard place to be, right? You're malnourished, you have very, poor access to nutritious food, good health care, education that's going to allow you to thrive, very poor opportunities for jobs, housing security. Like the bottom 10th is really, really hard place to be. But the bottom 10th in the United States is better off than 2/3 of the world's population, right? So that's winning the citizenship lottery, being an American citizen, right? As terrible as that is for many, many people in the United States, we need to put it into a global perspective, because so much of the discussion of borders and boundaries is we take the nation state as our starting point, right? And then we talk about borders and boundaries of any particular nation state. But if we look at what it does globally, I have definitely argued and would continue to argue that borders and boundaries today produce a system of global apartheid, where we maintain a system where the vast majority of the world's people are never going to gain access to the resources and the wealth that is hoarded in the rich world, right? And the rich world is the hardest place to get into on the planet, right? Getting into the United States, Canada, Norway, lawfully and being given rights when you're there is next to impossible for the vast, vast majority of the world's people. So borders are incredibly useful in maintaining a system of global apartheid. And they don't only operate to keep people out, they also operate because whatever status you get once you're inside, right? Because people do move and people are moving. Borders don't necessarily, border controls and immigration controls, walls and et cetera, don't necessarily keep people out, although they do kill a lot of people, but they don't necessarily keep everyone out. But what they do is that the status that the state gives you once you're in, the gold standard is citizenship, and then you move on down. Sorry, just one second. So, you're a citizen, or you're a lawful permanent resident, or you're a temporary migrant worker who is tied to her employer as a result of the visa that has been issued to you, or you are an undocumented person and you've been illegalized. That has enormous consequences for your well-being, for how much you're going to get paid, to whether you actually have mobility within the nation state, right? Because the fear of deportation for undocumented people means that not only do they have trouble crossing borders, but they have trouble going to the corner store for milk. Mm-hmm. Right? Because they can be deported, and especially under Donald Trump and Obama before him, that has really intensified. So borders, those statuses, what they do as well is that they serve employers the best, right? The tragedy of it is that many working class people imagine that borders protect them, right? We've got to keep them out. But in fact, what they do is they actually make their lives much more precarious, because those different statuses that people get, right, like the 12 million people in the United States who have been given the status of quote-unquote illegal, get paid on average about 200% less than someone with citizenship status, right? And that has this effect on the labor market that is very, very bad for all workers. Obviously, it's the worst for the person who's being paid starvation wages, but it's also bad for those of us who are not being paid starvation wages, right? Because there's a downward pressure on our wages. And so the best thing to do actually is act in solidarity with one another across these statuses, across borders. But ultimately, that would mean that we really need to question the global distribution of wealth and resources, right? And that's something that often doesn't get talked about when we're talking about the usefulness of borders and boundaries. So I just wanted to add to one thing that Kamana said that I found really helpful, which is that, people have learned how to live in a particular place really well sometimes, right? And the beautiful part of that is that that is something that can be learned. And I think that that sometimes gets forgotten in a world where we have like border thinking and we think like a state and everything is a border and a boundary and someone belongs and someone doesn't belong, is that everything that humans know, whether it's languages or how to cook particular food or how to live in a particular ecology, is learned behavior, right? None of us are born knowing anything about that. Right? So the beauty of that is that we are incredibly adaptable, right? And we can learn this stuff from each other to learn how to survive on a shared planet. And, going back to this model of scarcity, I mean, it's, the Norwegian herring disaster, like the Atlantic cod disaster, right, it wasn't a quote-unquote human-made disaster. It was a capitalist disaster. Right, so I think we also have to kind of separate humans from capitalists, humans in capitalist societies. Humans in pre-capitalist societies didn't have cod disasters and herring disasters, right? Like, there's a particular ecological model and a model of separation between us that capitalist societies in particular produce. So, a much better way to protect the world's resources would be to end capitalism and not just have like these small managed, capitalist economies of herring or cod. Right? I'm now ranting.
No,
Do you
yeah.
have anything to
Yeah, I
or
do.
sorry.
Well, I just find this really fascinating thinking about the ways that human and geographically drawn borders are so damaging. When I was thinking over this question, I was thinking about actually the way that figurative boundaries can be useful. And I think it kind of goes back to what Kamana was saying, is if we're thinking about boundaries as something that can be used as a means of respect, then perhaps we can think of them as necessary in certain cases, particularly to avoid erasure. So the example that I was thinking of is I work with bisexuality studies, and there's a kind of a forward momentum for bisexual erasure right now, because on the one side of the sexual identity spectrum you have heterosexual, on the other side you have homosexual, and then everything else in between is kind of called queer. And while queer can be a really useful term because it can incorporate identities that we don't necessarily have language for, identifying bisexuality specifically helps us to better understand one specific type of identity. It's kind of the same with pansexuality or any other type of sexuality, and there's hundreds of sexual identity terms. So in that case, and I'm definitely approaching it more from a figurative perspective than a literal perspective of borders, but a figurative boundary of the label of bisexual can help to protect from erasure. So I'm wondering, and I don't know if I'm getting in your way, Britton, but I was kind of going to throw out another question is, are there ways that boundaries and borders can be used literally to protect from erasure, or is that protection just constantly reinforcing that terror of the territory?
I mean, to me, I can see how you're saying that creating new categories and bounding off new places for identity could be useful in that way. But if I look back at how these things happen through history and think about, like, I've done a lot of research in South Asia looking at Hindu-Muslim conflict, and if you look at the ways that people practiced religion in Bengal, which is where I've done a lot of research, there's a long history of syncretism, of people doing a little bit of things that we might call Muslim today, and a whole series of other things we might call Hindu, and some other things we might call Buddhist today, but not necessarily thinking of themselves as any of those things specifically. That's just what people did in their village, and that's how they did things. But in the 1800s, the British show up with their censuses, and they need to know, are you a Hindu or are you a Muslim, right? And people have to figure out where they fit into these categorical boxes, and so that kind of blurred space and shared sets of practices that didn't fit in any of those things suddenly had to be one or the other. And so in the 1871 census of India and of Bengal specifically, the British didn't know that there were any Muslims in Bengal, right? They didn't think there were any there that were native to Bengal. They thought all the Muslims that were there were people that had come from like what's today Pakistan and were living in the cities. And so they were just shocked when they did the census, and more than half of the people checked Muslim as their identity on these categories, right? Because when they looked at them, they said they look like Hindus. They're going to Hindu festivals. They're doing all these Hindu things. But then what that produces in Bengal is once these categories exist, then the political system is based on that. So there's seats for Muslims and seats for Hindus, and so political parties get into organizing and defining these and separating them. So building mosques in rural areas for the Muslims to go to, or teaching Hindus that no, you shouldn't eat cows because that's sacred in Hinduism, right? And so kind of dividing out and creating these distinct categories that didn't exist, right? So the idea of Hindu-Muslim conflict wasn't something that was there until after these censuses and these categories created this binary that then became enacted and performed, and then sets off a lot of the violence in the years after that. So to me, the system of categorizing and forcing people into particular boxes can often have some negative consequences.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Thank you. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I agree. There's definite documented negative, consequences for bounding and defining yourself and the other and othering, and part of it is probably cross-cultural. It's not just the European way. And at the same time, erasures, right? I mean, so being Oiwi, being Kanaka Maoli, I mean, here I am, I'm sitting here. Probably anyone know the traditional name of this ili? It's Puahia, right? We're here in Puahia right now. This used to be, at one time, different period, we could say it was crown land. So it was part of the Hawaiian Kingdom's national land base that, prior to the legal overthrow of our constitutional monarchy, was Hawaiian land, right? And within Puahia, because of the boundaries of Puahia, it's in the Ahupua of Waikiki, there's specific reigns, right, that our people identified what directions the reigns come from. Part of it is based off of the boundary and the relationship to the wind direction, where the rain comes from, the intensity of the rain, the duration. Same thing with the winds, right? Probably none of us know that in this room right now. And I'm an associate professor at a university that, actually was founded by Lili'uokalani when she initially founded, tropical agriculture, in the so-called state of Hawaii here. And so I think that those erasures have had serious impacts on our people. And it's had impacts on our relationships with each other and just how we see ourselves. Today the lands are called public lands, right? After they overthrew the country, they severed the genealogical connections by renaming them to call them public lands. So I can't blame if someone flies in from Florida 2 weeks ago and they see a newspaper article that says, oh, the Hawaiians want money from the public lands, right? What about these lands made them public again? And that's another erasure. And if we went to the period, following the overthrow, where there were remnants of our traditional boundaries and relationships with resources that were still in place, what the U.S. government did was they went around Hawaii and they condemned the Konohiki fisheries. So what were still these semblances where people understood, hey, I'm not going to go fish over there because that's somebody else's place. I'm going to focus on making this place good, and maybe I don't have all the moe like the other Ahupua does, but man, the veil here is nice, They erased that. They condemned it, and they opened it up so that it's supposedly free for all. Anybody can fish whenever they want now. And what we've seen are tremendous declines. in our resource populations. That's another erasure that had serious impacts on our resources here in Hawaii today. So it's an irony, right? I mean, and again, I think part of when boundaries function well is when, if this is possible, they preserve, good relationships, like you said. But when they erase them and overlay them with other systems, it's problematic.
Thank you. We're getting close to the time I want to open up for questions. So one last sort of question to try and bring this all together. And going back to what you've all been talking about, I think is, to some degree, I mean, there is a necessity for distinction, right? I mean, if there were no difference between the table and the paper, right, the world would be a very confusing place. So there is an inherent necessity to distinguish A from B. It's kind of, otherwise we would live in a nothingness of indiscriminate unity, which may sound great, but I think functionally it would be a bit problematic. So I guess my final question is, as individuals and as scholars, I suppose just how might you respond to the two, I feel like there's been two sort of prongs to this. The one is the physical boundaries, right? The distinctions between land use, between people groups, between nation states, right? Lines on a map, and the identity issue. The fact that things are spectrums, but even on a spectrum, every spectrum has points. I mean, there are infinite points, but they're still there, right? So my final question is just how do you think you as an individual and as a scholar should respond, and more broadly, in general, how should we as people respond to these kinds of complex issues, I suppose? Who would like to dive into the impossible question?
Well, I think that this idea that challenging existing structures that are dependent upon the construction of boundaries and borders between people that have enormous consequences will lead to indiscriminate unity, to use your term, is a bit of a boogeyman, right? Like, is that the right term? English is not my first language. What is that? Boogie?
Yeah.
What is it?
Straw man.
I don't know.
Straw man, I think, is the one.
Yeah. So, boogeyman. Yeah. So, I always just think of disco when I hear that. So just think, what does that mean?
It's a great name.
But because no one is saying that what it means is that we need to stop having names for various ways of being and different things in the universe and etc. But it is a recognition that who we think we are and where we think we live and who we think we ought to be there with us or who should be excluded from that is a political choice. This is not a human choice. This is not a natural choice. This is not something that we are driven to do because of our human nature, right? These are political choices that we're making. And so I've been emphasizing the negative consequences of the political choices that have been made for the last several centuries to highlight the fact that who we think we are today is not who we were before. Right, like India, like I was born in India. There was no India before 1947, right? But me and my parents and my my parents were both born British subjects, right? My grandparents were born British subjects, and now we're all Indian citizens, and many of us are different kinds of citizens, and we act like that's always been there, like we've always been Indian. And that's just not true, right? So I think we need to pay attention to the changes that humans go through over time, and who it's important to be legible to, and why it's important to be an Indian citizen or whatever other citizen you are. Like, why does that become an important part of the human identity? And that's not an innocent project, right? And it reminds me of a story that was in a book written by James Scott called The Art of Not Being Governed, when which is a book about people who are attempting to escape states, right? Or escape people who are trying to act like states. Like this is, I get to decide what happens here, etc. And there's a beautiful story where, a group of people who had attempted to escape the state in Southeast Asia, running for the hills in Southeast Asia, were asked what their history was like. Who are you? What's your name? What's your history? Et cetera, et cetera. And they were like, we have no history. We don't want a history. This history business is killing us, right? Like, it's naming us. It's making us legible to the state. We don't want you to know anything about us. We're not going to do any history talking here, right? And it kind of reminds me of that used to be an escape route. And now many of us think that that's the path towards liberation, right? Like we need to very firmly identify ourselves as separate from others in order to claim political rights in an international world of nation states. You don't get to be self-determinate in this world of nation states post-World War II without being a nation. So those of us who cannot be nations, like me in the United States, cannot be a nation, right? I'm a minority at best, but I can't be I can't claim nationhood here and then claim, that I have a right to be self-determinate. So I think that, going back to this idea of the necessity to distinguish, like I just don't buy it, right? There's no evidence for that. There's lots of discussion of people who didn't feel the need to distinguish. Had many names for the same thing, right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
I see the world very similarly to Nandita, so I would echo most of what she just said. And I would just point out the fact that we are in some ways caught in this presentism of a sedentary existence and of the idea of nations and states and borders. But that's only a very brief period of the history of the world. Most of our ancestors in the past were mobile people, right? People were hunter-gatherers. They were voyaging. They were going to different places. They were not sedentary, right? So sedentarism is the unusual thing in the history of humanity, right? So if you think, it's probably 1% of the history of humanity is a sedentary existence, right? The 99% of the history of humans were mobile people, were moving around, or going from place to place. So that, if anything, that's the more natural state of affairs. This notion that particular groups of people have an exclusive right to a particular place is the new thing, right? And I see it as a system of exclusion. It's a way of protecting privileges and resources for particular people and excluding a lot of other people from the right to be in that place and the right to have access to those resources in that place. So just as the idea of sedentarism is very new, so is this idea of these very large groups of people that we think of today. I maybe would disagree a little bit with Nandita on that point, that I think maybe in the deep past people did have this groupism, this connection to their group, but it would be a very small group, right? It would be their family or their band of 20 people that they were with, or maybe their village of 300 people was their group, the inside group. And I think that that people probably have had some sense of that inside-outside of that for a long period of time. The really odd thing is that we feel those same sorts of connections to these huge groups of people today, right? Of 1.2 billion people in India, right? As a single category, as Indian, right? That's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's that these people do not have any sort of real meaningful connection to each other. It's an imagined thing. It's an invented thing to control people, to protect resources, to exclude other people for membership in these groups. And we don't have to live in a world that looks like that.
Yeah. So it's amazing because I agree with so many things that both my colleagues here are saying, and I guess I see it slightly differently, mostly because the way that I think about Palena and resources, and I think about people living in places. People live in places to me. They don't live in the whole world. Nobody lives in the whole world. We have technologies that supposedly link us today, like social media, where I can link up with a movement that's happening in North America because we share common second language, and I can learn about it immediately. But ironically, the more time you spend on social media, the more isolated you feel because you're not in a place. So I guess for me, Palena boundaries can work if they remind us of our relationship to the natural environment and the resources that are around us. And this is the biggest thing. So like today, if we could just change this concept, right, where if you rent, you own a 12,000 square foot lot or something, right? Like actually your relationship, so you take care of that 12,000 square foot lot, cut the grass, make sure dog doo-doo isn't on there. You wouldn't pour a bunch of oil all over your yard. You wouldn't throw a bunch of rubbish. But somehow you walk 3 blocks down and there's a stream and you throw your cigarette butt in there, right? And it's because your relationship is just to that 12,000 square foot boundary. That's where you see your connection, your kuleana, right? You're going to invest in that, try to sell it, make some profit, whatever it is. But if we could just extend that 12,000 square foot lot and think about our relationship to the ecosystem that we live in, how do we minimize our social decisions to impact that ecosystem, we get our world, in those places at least, to a better place, right? And in those instances, to me, Palena boundaries they can be effective if they help us to understand our relationships to our ecosystems and our environment and the very limited resources that we have to provide ourselves with.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of zooming into the personal and thinking about your question, Britton, about what we as individuals should do, both as scholars and as people. I think self-education can be really important, just coming to things like this and learning about the definitions of borders and boundaries. I feel like I've learned a lot tonight that I will take into my own personal life. And also, I think just having kind of grace and respect and compassion for one another, and starting with, we do need to think about global borders and boundaries in the way that they are so negatively affecting especially the poor and the minorities. But I think also to kind of make it a little bit more easy for us to kind of handle, I think we can think about our own personal boundaries and the way that we create boundaries between ourselves and others, sometimes through social media, and sometimes even, like going to the bank and not wanting to stand like too close to somebody, or getting in our car and being upset at another person who cut us off when they're another human that like is going through something in their life in this day. So I think having compassion is a good way to kind of break through personal boundaries.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open up for about 10-15 minutes. Anybody else questions for anyone on the panelists? Yes, in the back.
I just was very interested about your point about the term territory coming from terror. And if you could just quickly explain the etymology or the antecedents of, like, where does that come from?
Yeah, it's this is not my. I'm not an expert on those sorts of things, but it's. I think the word is terrorium or something like that, which means to scare off, to scare, to frighten. So the origin of the term territory is that notion, right, of terror, to create terror in someone from entering that space, right? There's a book called The Birth of Territory. It's by a scholar named Stuart Eldon, and he traces in very painful detail every possible use of the term territory back through the Western canon of writing. And so it's I read this in that book. And so if you want more details on it, that would be the place to go. The Birth of Territory.
Anyone else? Questions? In front and then in back. Then.
So 2 things. First, I just wanted to make a point that when Queer started, it was an attempt to reject all those categories. Mm-hmm. So it upsets me that it would be reclaimed back into another part of the same categories. Mm-hmm. So I almost affirm that So I think that it takes the potential out of the idea. So secondly, I think that the way that you folks have been talking about borders and boundaries are more about resources, which makes sense within that context. But what Kumano was saying made me think that if we apply it to stewardship or responsibilities rather than what you get out of it, it's a very different way of, that's not a bad thing. Because I don't want to take care of everything.
Yeah.
It would be good if Nandita did the laundry and I would just sweep and do the, right? So
a subtle hint that
she always does the laundry, right? So I never think about that. And I think that like what's possible about the our system is like, okay, I don't have to do this. I'll do that and I'll know a lot about it. And I think that it completely changes your relationship to both knowledge and to the land. I mean, basically to each other. And so I think it's a more productive way of thinking about it. And then I think it's the care is more about practice-based rather than identity-based too.
Can I comment on that? Sure. Yeah, but I think
You don't want to do the laundry.
We're designing robots for that.
I think that what you're getting at is not necessarily, like, I think what you're getting at is much more about a social division of labor than it is about the necessity to construct boundaries or borders around particular land or access to resources. So I think those are two different things, right? That I think that even in the commons, and I understand that there's a kind of Western etymology to the term commons, but I think that relationship of the commons is actually global, right? It's the relationship that humans had prior to the existence of classes and states. But I think, like, even in commons, you may very well have a division of labor, and we know that in pre-capitalist societies there was a social division of labor. But what was interesting about social divisions of labor pre-capitalist and capitalist societies is that they were much less rigid. So, for instance, like the gender division of labor, right? There may have been a gender division of labor, but it wasn't as rigid as today's idea of women's work versus men's work, right? Like those are kinds of much more recent boundaries, I guess, for lack, or a division of labor that's been constructed under capitalism. So I think we don't need to have what you're talking about. We don't need boundaries to have what you're talking about.
Thank you.
So when we were talking about sort of like sexuality boundaries and how we were talking about how the false dichotomy of you either being homosexual or heterosexual, but then there was also queer. I think you mentioned how it was possible that boundaries could be beneficial in helping the queer like define themselves. And then you mentioned that like boundaries on religion, Hindu or Muslim, and how they were like threatening to the Muslim people. Do you think that that's because of the boundaries themselves or because of people's actions towards groups who don't even choose to define themselves that way?
I think that's a tough question. I guess the point that I would make is that the in a lot of instances, there's a past history of people having much more fluid identities and belongings, right? And not the kind of fixed and bounded categories that we ascribe to people today. And that it seems to me that often when we use these very sharp categories, that tends to create conflict between people, right? Because you don't identify with the people in this separate group because that's not you, right? They're the other. They're different. They're distinct. And I think that you can see that in in the example that I gave before of the kind of the emergence of Hindu-Muslim conflict in South Asia is one example of that. But I think you see that just in terms of how we think of states today, right? If you think of your identity as being American and then Mexican is separate from that, right? And it allows the othering of that and the distinction between that, and inscribes a whole series of privileges and rights to the people in your group that those other people shouldn't have. And so I think that those sorts of categories can be really destructive and can cause a lot of problems with the way that we kind of think of our place in the world and who has rights to be in a particular place.
Yeah, and I also, I think what really, I think what you're asking is kind of about the language of it, right? Like, how deeply does the language of identity labels affect the way that people see themselves and the way that people see others? And so it's more about, it's the boundary then is kind of going back to what we were talking about right in the beginning of this panel, the way that boundaries are imaginary, and even the boundaries of language are imaginary and socially constructed, and can be, as Reese is saying, extremely damaging because people's imaginations are really creative, right, and can be really fear-driven. And I think that, but ultimately, I think that you're right that the boundaries, I mean, the way that I see it, I think the boundaries themselves can be useful and also can be very damaging. I don't think it's necessarily like one or the other, and it's the way that we understand the boundaries and the way that we react to them. That's what causes this destructiveness.
Yeah, just one thing is, I think that human beings, of course, are meaning-making animals. I'm sure other animals are as well. Probably everything is meaning-making, but humans, are meaning-making animals. So we do make meanings. We have a sense of who I am, who you are, the place that I'm in, on and on, right? But I think that something shifts when there's a shift in social relationships towards class relationships, towards state-governed relationships. And one of those shifts is the greater demand for purity and authenticity in your subjectivity, right? And that's when we get these kind of very hard identity categories. So the need to prove to me that you're a proper man, and the need for me to prove to people that I'm a proper woman, or the need for me to prove to people that I'm a proper Indian, right, or a proper Canadian, right? Like, I get asked those questions on a very, very regular basis, right? What do you like to eat? What sports do you like? And it is always an either or. Do you like cricket or do you like hockey? Right? Do you like roti or do you like sandwiches? Right? And it's just like this constant need. Someone wants to know, and I have to demonstrate to them through this politics and performance of purity and authenticity who I really am, right? Because the identity category is defining me rather than me defining myself.
Justin had a question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question concerning territoriality as a strategy. Biologists have investigated territoriality in animals, and it might be surprising that territoriality is actually a rare strategy among animals.
Where were you when we needed you?
The vast majority of animals are not territorial. And it's also not the case that a particular species will always act with territoriality. It's flexible. So scientists, biologists have looked for correlations. When do we see territoriality in nature? When is it a productive strategy? When are the benefits to being territorial, when those benefits outweigh the costs? Because territoriality is a very costly strategy. And the results of looking across studies, the results are actually surprising too, I think. You'd think there might be a correlation with population density. As the population density increases, we see an increased prevalence of territoriality. You don't see that. You might think that resource density has an effect on it. We don't see that. What does stand out as a consistent correlation is territoriality seems to be a good strategy we actually see it in nature when resources are predictable, when the spatial distribution of resources is predictable. So annually, there's water available here, so it pays to invest in defending the space, even when the water is not there, because we know it will be there in the future. Same thing with fruit trees. It pays to defend this territory, to make that investment, because we know, we can predict, we can rely upon the fact that those resources will be there on regular intervals or at some point in the future. So kind of taking a perspective of applying those lessons to ourselves, lots of things are changing with resources currently. Some resources are becoming more abundant and some resources are becoming less abundant, but we also see major changes in how predictable these resources are. If predictability of resources decreases, I would think we would see a decrease in territoriality. Might any of you have some examples that could tie into that lesson?
I don't necessarily have any examples that could tie into that lesson, but I think that there's another book about human territoriality, written by Robert Sack, who was a geographer's mid-'80s book. And what he argues in that book is he argues that human territoriality is distinct from animal territoriality. He thinks of it as a human strategy to control resources and people. But what he argues is that it's the most efficient mechanism for humans to control a set of resources. And he makes the point that there are lots of different ways to claim the things in a particular place, right? You could, you could mark every single thing as your own, right? You could label everything, or you could name every piece of thing in a particular space, but all of those take a lot of time to do. But if you just blanket and say, everything within this box is mine, it's a really efficient way to claim those resources and make very clearly communicate what you're claiming and what other people can't have access to. And so that's why he argues it's a very effective way for humans to control access to resources.
That's interesting because that's exactly how biologists would describe it in regard to animals. So a biologist probably wouldn't say that there's a difference there. A biologist wouldn't say, well, let me just say, I wouldn't say that territoriality is a human construct, it's invented by humans, and it's only beneficial to humans.
I'm afraid we're getting a bit late. Does anyone have one more question? Otherwise, we'll close it up for the night. We're all looking a bit haggard, tired, you guys. Okay, so first off, I was going to give a round of applause to our amazing panel. And, thank you all for coming. My last sort of spiel for the evening is just, I think one of the things that I love about what we're trying to do here is it comes down to listening well, doesn't it? It comes down to being open to perspectives distinct from your own. I'm a medieval literary scholar, and yet I'm learning from scholars from very different disciplines, very different perspectives. And I feel like that's the strength of this kind of exercise, is to recognize that our vision is very often singular, and it helps to have a collective vision, to be able to listen and therefore see the world differently when you leave these doors. And I hope that when you do leave these doors, the world is different for you. So just to say, we have one final Converging Epistemologies event next week, Friday, from 6:30 to 8 p.m. The topic of that one is post-humanism and, what was the other one? Transhumanism, that are apparently distinct. I figured we figure out what the distinction is later. We have an amazing set of panelists. That one's going to be a very science-heavy panel. We have Karen Meach, who was part of the panel that discovered the first extrasolar object ever, who's based here. We have Kim Binstead, who is an artificial intelligence expert and also is the lead scientist for the High Seas project. That's where they pretend they're living on Mars, but they're actually in the Big Island thing. And so it's going to be a very interesting panel to talk about questions, including things like, do we augment ourselves with technology? How far do we use things like CRISPR to edit our genes? I mean, I hate glasses. If I could tweak a gene and not wear them, I would do that in a heartbeat. Our questions about what does it mean, for instance, if a baby is born on Mars, example from last time, what nation do they belong to, right? If they're born on another planet, what happens to them biologically speaking as they grow up in a place with slightly less gravity than us? Can they return to Earth? Would they be Mars bound for the rest of their existence? What would that mean? So those are the kinds of questions our panelists will deal with, and I really hope to see you there. Thank you once again for coming.
Thanks for your monologue.
You too.
Yeah. Interesting.
I'm sure.
How you doing?
I'm sure I need to read
Yeah,
much more about Hawaiian history.